Welcome to the History Politics Podcast, Putting the Past to Work from UCLA's Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now.
Welcome to the History Politics Podcast, Putting the Past to Work. I'm Rose Campbell, Assistant Director of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, which hosts this podcast. The relationship between Native Americans and museums has historically been characterized by an imbalance of power and a colonial desire to keep and collect items for study and display in museums. Particularly in the early days of American anthropology, it was common practice to obtain these cultural items, and even human remains, through dubious, if not outright illegal and certainly immoral methods. And many institutions felt that they had the rights to retain and study these remains. In 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which has become some of the most influential legislation surrounding Native peoples of the U.S. The law allowed Native American tribes to file claims for human remains, grave goods, sacred objects, and important cultural items from any institution receiving federal funds. At the same time, these institutions were required to assess their collections and make a good faith effort to identify and return these remains. An update to NAGPRA, which took effect in early 2025, required institutions to obtain consent before exhibiting cultural items or human remains, strengthening the authority of tribal knowledge in repatriation claims, and implementing stricter deadlines to expedite repatriation when possible. Joining us today to discuss repatriation and the relationship between Native tribes and museums are Stephen Aaron and Joe Horscapture. Steve is the Calvin and Marilyn Gross Director, President, and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West. In this role, he has led the Autry and its exhibitions toward more critical considerations of how we conceptualize the history of the West and the role of Native communities. He is also currently considering how museums can rethink repatriation and their relationships with Native communities to promote healing and collaboration moving forward. Joe is the Vice President of Native Collections and Engagement, Amundsen Curator, and the Chief Curator at the Autry. Joe recently organized and curated an exhibition at the Autry titled Creative Continuities, Family, Pride, and Community in Native Art, which features reflections from 3 contemporary Plains Indian artists on Native works created by their ancestors and displayed in the exhibition. Welcome to both of you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with a little bit of background. Steve, could you talk a little bit about your background and how you ended up at the Autry?
Well, as I think you know, Rose, and some people may be listening to this podcast, I spent most of my career as a professor of Western history, history of the American West at UCLA. And I guess one of the proudest legacies I left when I retired from UCLA to take the position at the Autry was the role I played in helping to establish the Luskin Center for History and Policy, of which this podcast is a part. I was fortunate during my time at UCLA to be able to, for a number of years, to split my appointment between UCLA and the Autry Museum. And that's how I became involved back in about 2002 or so with the Autry as the founding executive director of what was then the Institute for the Study of the American West, which oversaw the libraries, research, publications, programs, and education departments at the Autry. So that's how I've sort of came through and have now found my way into the museum world.
Well, a huge thank you again for your pivotal role in the foundation of LCHP. We're so glad that not only you contributed to that, but that you can join us again here today. And Joe, how about you? What is your background and how did you end up at the Autry?
So I'm Joe Horscapture. I am a member of the Aani tribe located in Fort Belknap Reservation in north central Montana. I am a second generation curator. My father, George Horscapture Sr., was one of the first Native American curators in the country in 1979 at the Plains Indian Museum in Cody, Wyoming. Whenever your parents that tell you that they want you to do something and follow in your footsteps, a natural way of thinking, particularly as a young person, is no way, I'm never going to do that. So of course my father encouraged me to be in the museum business, and I was like, no way, I'm not going to do that. Until I got an internship at the Minneapolis Institute of Art in 1990, working under Dr. Evan Maurer. And I was there as an intern, and I realized, dang it, I'm really enjoying this. So I worked with Evan for a couple of years, ended up going back to Montana. I went to college. Then went back to the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where I was a curator there for 15 years. Then I went to National Museum of the American Indian for a couple of years in DC. Back to Minnesota for the Minnesota Historical Society for a few years. Had different gigs in Europe, and then I've been here at the Autry since 2020.
So you've worked all over not just the country, but the world then. That sounds like a
Well,
lot.
just Europe. I wouldn't say the world, but just Europe. I've been very, very lucky in the work that I've been doing.
Well, so given this broad experience, I would love to hear a little bit more about the history of Native art and collections in museums, how those have been handled, how tribes have interacted with museums, and how that relationship has gone.
Sure. So the terms are always a bit loaded. The term, native art really is a reasonably new thing. One of the first times that museums, as though they impose themselves as the authority, had really organized a native art show wasn't until, the 1930s. But prior to that, native works, native objects were just things. They're part of the ethnographic part of the world. And they get put in with all the other non-Western cultures, Africa, Oceanic, and Native America. So that has been happening for a very long time. Originally a cabinet of curiosities. Everybody sort of got on board to collect the other, the exotic. Even at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, he has his grand hall, which actually isn't that grand, where he collected many Native American objects as well from his different travels. But I think the interesting part about it, which I think probably happened to many of these cultures, Africa, Oceanic, and Native America, is when these works were collected, they were often collected without the consent, or certainly under questionable circumstances from the cultures where the works came from. So that creates a number of problems. It creates a problem for the culture, excuse me, obviously, because they're losing these items, which are very, very important to their cultural well-being. Then they end up in museums where, they're only handled, I always say tongue in cheek, they're handled, in climate control. You can only have certain kind of humidity and temperature and light. God forbid you actually touch them with your hand. But, these works were actually, they were loved. They were in the community, they were being used, they were maybe sold under duress. Sometimes they're outright stolen. But these works now sit in multiple facilities all over the world, including us, and they were taking from the culture, and oftentimes the tribes still want to continue these ways, or maybe they have these items that certainly help them fulfill their whether they're ceremonies or cultural well-being or whatever the case may be. So it is sort of quite the challenge to try to figure out how to rebuild and make these connections again.
Well, and if I can follow up briefly on that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of museums used to also house Native American remains and objects in their natural history section, right?
Absolutely.
Which then ideologically separates it from other art or people of the world because it's considered other in that sense, kind of you talked about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of human remains, funerary objects.
Yeah.
All the bad aspects of that type of collecting.
Yeah, definitely a fraught history. So I'd like to move now to Steve for a moment and talk about NAGPRA legislation, which was a huge step forward in this relationship between Native tribes and museums. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the history of NAGPRA and historically how museums have interacted with Native individuals and tribes through the lens of NAGPRA.
So I often, and I realize this is an audio only podcast, but here's one moment that I wish it were visual because I've learned to sort of explain this more with my hands, talk with my hands. So you're going to have to sort of maybe describe what I'm doing. But in the show version of this, as opposed to the merely tell, I sort of often say that the historical relationship, and this echoes most of what Joe was just saying, um, the historical relationship was museums here, and I'm holding one hand above my head, and Native communities here, and now I'm holding one hand at my waist. Or actually, now I'm switching that hand behind my back to suggest that certainly prior to NAGPRA, and for the long history that Joe was describing in the relationship between museums and Native communities, museums held all the power, essentially, and Native communities were not only just down here, but they were often completely out of the picture, forgotten, when it came to making decisions about how objects should be handled or conserved, how they should be interpreted, how they should be exhibited, to whom they might be loaned, et cetera, et cetera. NAGPRA tried, emerging in 1990, that act tried to reframe that relationship. It was at least a first attempt within the United States, and it only applied within the United States, to try to bring Native communities into the picture again and to allow them to have a voice and a say, starting with reclaiming and repatriating objects into their collections. I think, though, that whatever the intentions were, and Joe can speak to this, I think, in more depth because he has more historical experience with it, whatever the intentions were behind the original iteration of NAGPRA in 1990, it didn't always work out the way it was supposed to. And in fact, a lot of museums, I would argue, filibustered or simply didn't really put the resources into play to try to activate repatriation efforts. And so I think a lot of, although certain things move forward, I think there was an awful lot of stalling and institutions that really did very little in terms of sending things back to their sending objects and human remains and funerary objects back to their home communities.
So let's follow up on that for a minute then, because it sounds like one of the original shortcomings of NAGPRA was that there weren't necessarily consequences for these institutions that might have dragged their feet a little bit, if I'm understanding you correctly. So what were some of the shortcomings of NAGPRA in its original form?
Well, I think, Joe, you want to speak a little bit to this because you actually dealt with it much more than I did.
Yeah, so as Steve mentioned, 1990 version of NAGPRA is certainly well intended, but it gave a lot of power to museums to determine where items came from, and they would make the final determination of what returned. And I think for many Native communities, and of course I can't speak for all Native communities, I can only discuss my experience, their number one priority is going to be their ancestors, right? Getting their ancestors back and putting them back in their community and laying them to rest. Then following that is funerary objects and sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony, often referred to as cultural items. But as Stephen mentioned, a lot of the museums, they had drugged their feet. They wouldn't necessarily turn in the paperwork on time. There was some consequences, but I'm not sure they were enforced very well at all. And so putting the museum to have all the power, right? So at some point, some anthropologist somewhere did all the collecting that ends up in the museum. Native tribe says, hey, you have our ancestors there, and we'd like them back. And museums will make a determination whether that's a thumbs up or a thumbs down. So it really weighs heavy on museums to make this determination, which was shown as in Tribes Expressed, and I think both Steve and I would agree that having museums have all that type of power is extremely problematic when you're working with a living culture and have human remains and items that probably should not be housed in a museum.
Yeah, quite the power imbalance there. Who
Yeah.
gets to decide who owns history in a lot of ways.
So, in some sense, then to anticipate what happens, then I think obviously you referenced the revisions or the reframing of NAGPRA in the 2025, the new regs put out there. I would say that some museums also began to change, and I'd like to think that the Autry was one of those museums that tried to instigate some of that change, even apart from the federal legislation. That in 2022, we put in place our management of native collections policy, which in many ways anticipated what was to come with the 2025 revision to the Federal Act or to the NAGPRA regulations. In our case, we mandated that the Autry would collaborate with, consult with, gain the consent of native source communities before we would exhibit or material, how we would display it, what we would display, to whom we might loan it, how we would work and conserve it. And so we began, I think, with that internal policy, not alone. Other museums, I think, were doing similar things to shift the balance already. And then I think the new regs put in place to mandate many of those things, as well as, and this is the critical, I think, distinction between that and the 1990s, as well as to shift, as Joe put it, the balance of power more towards native knowledge, to empower native knowledge, to give, I would argue, primacy to it in the absence of other compelling evidence, certainly, so that native testimony about the what these objects were would carry greater weight than whatever some anthropologist might have said from 80 or 100 years ago or 150 years ago, whenever the materials were collected.
So let's actually talk about that for a moment. What are these new additions to NAGPRA? What do they mean for museums, and how do they change the game?
Well, a couple of things. First, it shortens the timeline where museums need to respond to repatriation requests, and also when they need to post it and work more with tribes. Secondly, human remains and funerary objects, those are, for lack of a better way of putting it, almost no-brainers that they need to be returned, right? I mean, I think in this day and age, it's very challenging to find a museum that disagrees with having the ancestors go back to their home community. So the next section, of course, is sacred objects that are housed in museum collections, and then cultural items. And the new repatriation law, or the addendum to NAGPRA, really puts a lot of power with native knowledge. Because before, in order to sort of prove something was sacred, it needed to be documented. So, which means a non-native anthropologist deems what is sacred. So, I find this in Bureau of American Ethnology, Volume 42, page 126. It says this, therefore it's okay. Where with the new with a reconfigured law, it says that native knowledge, aka oral tradition, takes primacy over deeming what the item is. So that, which is really, really important, because it definitely sort of changed the power to go more with native communities, which is great. Also, in the previous version, it really sort of spells out what is qualified. What is you have to prove what a sacred object is. You have to prove what an item of cultural patrimony is. And I'd mentioned that designation comes from the tribes, but also in the new regulations, it uses a term cultural items. And in the new legislation, if you look at what cultural items are and how one defines that, it does not say that the museum defines it, and says that what cultural items are defined by the tribe. So it really changes the dynamic to put a lot more power in the tribe. to deem what is important to them, and at the end of the day, what they would like to claim under repatriation. So I think those are really, really transformational points that really change the law in favor of native tribes having many of their items. And I've said before, human remains and funerary objects are sort of no-brainers, but items return back to their home communities.
Steve, would you like to add anything about how museums have worked with repatriation? You already talked a little bit about the Autry specifically, but with these new NAGPRA regulations.
Well, one thing is, and I think it's important to make this distinction, and this is what I worry about too. We sometimes blur here by talking about new legislation. And it's not new legislation because obviously, um, uh, that would require an act of Congress. And this was not the 2025 regs. That the original 1990 is from an act of Congress. It's the law. The 2025 is a reinterpretation of how the law should work. And my concern is, well, I worry in the grander scheme that one, the Trump administration might overturn the new regs, as they do other Biden era initiatives, or the courts might see this as administrative overreach in the way that some of the decisions by U.S. courts have, especially by conservative courts, have turned different kind of administrative rulings aside, have turned different kind of administrative rulings aside. So my own issue is, I think, and I sometimes argue that we need to think of NAGPRA not as the ceiling, which I think too often it has been thought of by many museums, but as the floor upon which to build a very different kind of relationship between museums and Native communities, one based on mutual respect, and one based on, I would argue, shared stewardship. And so from my point of view at the Autry, I hope the direction we're moving in and the Native Collections policy that we put in place in 2022 certainly sets that direction, is towards one in which we maybe explore different forms of who owns what even. And maybe we sort of cede ownership, but we continue to sort of to conserve and hold at the tribe's behest in some cases. But again, only displaying it or what we do with it, again, requiring the consent of the source community. So I hope that where we're moving in terms of museums' relationship with Native communities and the larger scheme of repatriation is one that, as I say, goes beyond where NAGPRA goes and really, I think, creates something different and I hope better for both museums and Native communities.
If I can just follow up on what Steve said, I think this is really an important point, is many museums, including ours, ours is telling the story of the West. And if you're not working with the folks who you are presenting or featuring in your museum, are you really telling that story properly? So I think with the Native American collection policy, at least for us on the Autry side, first, and then the modification of NAGPRA, it really sort of sets an example that if we're going to tell stories in the gallery and in our museum or education materials, programming, whatever the case may be, you have to work with the people of where these items come from. Otherwise, you're telling a story without their consent. And of course, one would argue, is that really a story? So I think our Native collections policy, as well as NAGPRA, really forces museums, and for us, we certainly embrace this change to ensure that we work with these communities when we tell their stories, when people come and research, whatever the case may be. Really, really important.
So I think actually this would be a good opportunity in terms of giving a concrete example. Joe, if you would talk a little bit about how the exhibit that's currently on display at the Autry, and I'm nothing as a director, if not one who's going to put shameless plugs forward for the Autry Museum, if you would talk a little bit about how creative continuities came together as a model of how this kind of exhibition making works?
So in 2022, I reached out to three Native American artists, John Pepion from Blackfeet, Brocade Stops Black Eagle from Crow, as well as Jesseray Growing Thunder from Fort Peck, with the idea of creating an exhibition in a way through their eyes. And it was really important to me to find folks who are reasonably well versed with their cultural ways. Secondly, it was important to me to find younger people as opposed to this, ancient Native American elder who bestows this knowledge. I wanted to avoid that. I really wanted to show that these these narratives are really embedded within their tribe, and of course, the best way to demonstrate that is through younger people. So I worked with all three of them. They came out a few times together, as well as individually, and we pulled the works from their communities, which we have in our collection, and we worked together to make a selection of items, and then from there we sort of broke it down into different themes. And as we were talking about these items, I recorded everything with their consent. And through that recording, I made transcripts for all three of them, about 70 pages each. And I really wanted the visitor not to get sort of the strange heavenly voice of the curatorial bestowed upon them in the gallery. Instead, I wanted the narrative to come from real people, real native folks who are related to these items because it came from their ancestors. So the show, I think, and I haven't done the numbers, is probably maybe 90% first person voice. So it's in their voice, which I think adds a real nice tangibility to it. And then, so I started that in 2022. And when the repatriation law was modified, I had to double back and reach out to the THPOs, Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, who are the official government, tribal government arm that takes care of these type of issues. I reached out to them and told them what we're doing and who we're working with, and what items we're going to use. Some of them were like, "Yeah, that's fine." Some of them were, "I like to see the text before it goes to the gallery," which is all fine. So we, got that blessing to go forward. But I think for me, it really demonstrates a number of things. That first person voice is, particularly in the museum setting, I think is critical, not only for the understanding of the work, but also I would argue that I think the visitor connects better with the first person voice. Secondly, is these items in the gallery are not only consented for the curatorial consultant we work with, but also from the tribe. So it's really, it's very fortunate to have really good folks to work with. The THPOs were great to work with, and I think it's certainly a model that we will continue to use in the future.
I mean, I would say compare that approach and the resulting exhibition with, I guess, the kind of natural history museum exhibition that you probably saw as a child. I think fewer and fewer of those, many of the natural history museums have abandoned that older style. But compare the exhibition that Joe described with the kind of exhibition that you used to see in natural history museums presenting this material, again, as dead things from a distant past with an omniscient anthropological curatorial voice, sort of providing whatever commentary and expertise was deemed required or deemed necessary.
No dioramas, no little tiny Indians in the museum, pushing buffalo off a cliff or spearing mammoths. That's off the table.
Well, I think actually one of the other things to emphasize about creative continuity is, I would argue, is it's very much an art exhibition, both contemporary work and historical work in dialogue with one another, and the contemporary artists providing the commentary that creates the conversation between the work by ancestors and the work by present day artists.
Wonderful. So, as we wrap up here, I'd like to get each of your thoughts on the future, things that you hope to see for relationships between Native tribes and museums, and this idea of repatriation. We've been throwing around this term a lot. Is that the term we should be using? Is there some other term that we should use instead to symbolize this hopefully more collaborative and equal relationship with tribes? What do you hope for going forward?
So, because I'm a slave to alliteration, I don't know that I can get beyond our words, but ones that have been suggested. Look, repatriation up until relatively recently, as I did a study of this, repatriation until really the 1980s almost always referred to the returning of people to their countries from which they had been expelled. And that certainly has important meaning in Native America, where removal and relocation were the common denominator of most Native American experiences. Some have suggested that restitution might be a better word, reparation, restoration. Somewhere I'm going to get beyond our words here, but I do think there's, as I say, a variety in play. To me, what's most important, as I said, is to try to move beyond that problematic historical relationship, and to really pioneer new approaches. I think we have models, for example, in other countries, Canada comes to mind, where they eschewed the legalistic framework that NAGPRA and moved towards trying to create relations based on, as I say, mutual understandings and conversations between museums and Native communities. Sometimes that's worked, sometimes less so. But as I say, I'd like to move beyond where everything is hashed out by lawyers. Nothing against lawyers, but I'd rather move to a system where, as I said, we built our relationship on other foundations. And I think Joe and I have had some conversations, including about some objects that are now under consideration for accession into the Autry's collection, about really steering them in a different direction to open up this, I think, different future and different way of thinking about who owns the past and who owns or who might control these objects.
So, Steve, if I can add another word to your R word salad, uh, I would, I would add reclaim.
Mm.
It's native tribes. Again, I can't speak for everybody, but it's been my experience. Native tribes, they want to reclaim. They want to reclaim how their history is told. They want to reclaim works that were important to their ancestors, which reflectively are important to them. They want to reclaim their ancestors. It's pretty straightforward one there. Want to reclaim their language, reclaim their food, reclaim their life ways. To me, it's really about reclaiming. Now, with the relationship between museums and tribes, as we mentioned earlier, it has always historically been a very hostile one. And of course and understandably so. And many tribes are challenged by museums today, again, understandably so. But I hope that there is a opportunity where museums, of course, are experts in taking care of items, telling stories, these type of things, where we can work collaboratively with tribes. And not everybody is going to want to do that. It's completely understandable. Where we can work collaboratively on presentation of items, obviously returning items as they see fit, but really a partnership, I guess one would say, to ensure that the stories that they want to tell can be told in a proper way. And as Steve mentioned, that may mean co-ownership, which is great, but we need to really sit down together and redefine, those who want to sit down and redefine what this relationship looks like. I think it's very, very important.
So if I may also, again, put on my plugging hat, and that is to say, to think about the immediate future. Joe has already touted, and I hope convinced all in your audience, Rose, to come to see Creative Continuities and come visit the Autry. But here, I want him to now tease his upcoming exhibition on which he's been working for several years. And this one, I think, will certainly attract you all to the Autry starting in the fall of 2027. Joe.
So I've been working for a few years on this exhibition. It's about Native American skateboarding. It opens up here September 2027, and I'm working with 5 Native American communities. I'm working with Blackfeet, Pine Ridge, Fort Belknap, Bolivia, there's a skate community down there, as well as Warm Springs, Oregon. And as one surprising to many folks is there's a lot of skate parks in Native communities, either on their reservation or close to them. And the show is really about, it's several, sort of has several different themes to them. One of them is how Native artists use skateboard decks as a form, artistically, as a form of cultural expression. The other aspect is how skateboarding, particularly in the homeland, impacts them in their culture in a way. How does it rebuild it? Or how does it fortify it? And how do these small communities really help youth? Also, some of the decks reference have designs related to historical objects. So there's a conversation between the decks and kind of what they do, as was items that were created by their ancestors. So we did our homework with our planning. The show opens up here at the Autry on September 2027, and they'll be up for a year and a half, which means it'll be here for the Olympics. And as we know, skateboarding, which is a Southern California invention, although surfing is a native invention, we'll make sure that the show is up for the Olympics. And I look forward to everybody coming to the Autry, of course, signing up for the membership first, and then coming to the Autry for exclusive previews of the exhibition.
Well, on that note, I will add to the list since they do go to the Autry. It is exceptional, and I have seen the Creative Continuities exhibition. It was wonderful, and now I'm really excited about this skateboarding one, which also sounds amazing. So thank you both so much for joining us today, for sharing your perspectives, and we appreciate your time and all of your unique insights.
You're very welcome. A pleasure.
Thank you, Rose. It was fun.
Thank you for listening to the History Politics podcast, Putting the Past to Work, from UCLA's Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Rosalind Campbell, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.